Well, the fight over the fiscal cliff is kind of sort of behind us, but what is the next budget fight here and what's getting most attention in D.C.? It's an oldie but a goodie. We're talking about the debt limit, Andrew. Familiar lines in the sand here, and for people getting frustrated, I don't blame them because you kind of know how this thing's going to end.
I'm one of them at this point, Rich. After this whole fiscal cliff thing, the U.S. officially hit and passed the debt limit in the final days of 2012, but thanks to some number juggling by the Treasury Department, we won't face a default until February 15th at the earliest. But the rhetoric on whether to extend the limit has already begun. Last week, Republican Senators Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania and John Cornyn of Texas, in separate interviews, suggested they'd be willing to shut down the government and risk a default if there aren't enough spending cuts included in any deal over the debt limit. The reaction from the top Republican in the Senate: we can cut enough spending right now if only the president and Democrats in Congress will take the lead.
We know we need to do it. When are we going to do it? We don't need to use the deadlines. We could go through the regular order. Congress could pass bills. They could have conferences between the House and Senate. The president could be engaged.
But not every Republican seems so willing to play chicken with the debt limit again. Newt Gingrich called the idea a loser, not for fear it might damage or the damage it might do, but because he believes Republicans will blink and approve a debt limit increase. Perhaps Gingrich was thinking of the debt limit position taken by one of his political idols.
Congress consistently brings the government to the edge of default before facing its responsibility. This brinkmanship threatens the holders of government bonds and those who rely on Social Security and veteran benefits. Interest rates would skyrocket, instability would occur in financial markets, and the federal deficit would soar. The United States has a special responsibility to itself and the world to meet its obligations.
And no, the great communicator was not underwater at the time of that comment. But Ronald Reagan, no less. And guys, the numbers are the last 3 Republican presidents have approved 28 different debt limit increases. And with real numbers at the time, I didn't hear a peep of this during the Bush years. What are we doing? We all know how this is going to end. We really have to go through this rigmarole. We already spent the money. We now going to say all of a sudden, never mind?
What is going to get Congress and the White House to cut spending? What is going to get it to do it? And if you've got another way to do it, do it. But this is the only way that we've ever gotten the president's attention. We Republicans.
But the problem with this, I understand the point, but here's the real problem. Take the $60 billion for Sandy relief. Do you know there are members of Congress, Richard, as you know, that said, in voting no, of helping people, of helping Americans, that said, well, we got to pay for it first. So, I mean, come on. We understand we've got to cut, but it's taking the argument too far. It goes too far.
The hypocrisy of it, where not a penny of Iraq, of the war in Iraq or Afghanistan was funded, not a peep as to how we're going to pay for it. But more importantly, can I just ask a practical question? As asinine as Washington can be, we saw what happened at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, okay, and New Year's Day. They're going to pass this thing. Why do we go through all the theater and the wasted time?
I can answer your question.
But they're not going to get what they want this way.
Well, all I can tell you is that the view on the part of the Republicans was that if they'd given up earlier, they would have gotten less of restoring some of the Bush tax cuts. They got about 95% of the Bush tax cuts. They got them permanent, and the view was that they wouldn't have gotten that 2 weeks earlier.
But it's a little bit like swatting flies with a flamethrower. I mean, it's effective, but the damage you can do if it goes wrong is horrible.
I'm not going to insult you by telling you the consequences of this to the global economy, not just to the U.S. And for what?
I'm not going to insult you by telling you the consequences. If we don't get a handle on our spending, your kids are doomed.
Absolutely, and I don't disagree. We got to do something about entitlement reform.
So that's the answer to your question.
But the other thing is, if the Republicans are so concerned about this, why haven't I heard? I keep hearing about how we're going to close loopholes. Where's the specificity? And why is that now off the table? They talked about it during the campaign that there was going to be, as one of the revenue escalators, that was a nice way to say in raising taxes, they were going to close the loopholes. I'm still waiting for item 1 that they're going to close with some specificity. That's never happened. But the fiscal watchdogs now want to take us to the brink again, and I agree with you. You got to do something about Medicare. You got to do something about Social Security.
I don't think you do agree with, because I don't think you feel the way I feel.
Not this way, though.
Well, I don't know how else it's going to get done.
Okay, well, Congressman, why can't it start with cutting the Defense Department then? If cuts have got to be done, why can't we start with defense?
I think it's got to start with defense and social programs both. You got discretionary spending, the everyday spending of government. Yeah, that's one part. And then you got 50% of our government that's now on entitlements. And the entitlements are squeezing out some very important spending on the discretionary stuff.
Well, how about this? Why couldn't they have stayed, I'm sorry, Andrew, why couldn't they have said, all right, you know what, we had sequestration on the table. Instead of doing the across-the-board cuts as steep as we said, let's cut the number in half, but let's go with that. And across the board, all departments, if they want to do it.
Remember, this was the last Congress. There was a Congress that got elected in November. So I do think it's the responsibility of the Congress that's coming up.
You do know we know how this story ends, and all of the, again, you were there, all the wasted pontificating and dancing, they're gonna, at the end, raise the limit, or the president can exercise the 14th Amendment. But it's gonna happen one way or the other, and I just wish all the posturing, there's also another practical thing. We spent the money already. What are we gonna do? Default on our obligations?
Right.
I mean, we are America, right?
So tell me what happens if we don't get a control on spending. Tell me what happens.
I believe we should, but I don't believe this is the way to do it. Because of,
So what is the way to do it?
I would call the president out. Call the president out, the Republicans, to say, we will find
The Senate
of our
hasn't
own.
passed a budget in over 3 years. They have not gotten the Senate to pass a budget in 3 years. And the press and everyone else has been very willing to say, well, the Senate hasn't passed a budget. The only way we're going to get the attention of some of these folks is to call the question.
But actually, you're pointing out two other ways. The biggest hypocrite in this whole thing is President Obama. When he was a senator, he voted against raising the debt limit. Let's start with that, talking about hypocrites.
He did?
Secondly, there are two other ways. There are two other cliffs here. This is not the only one. Because as you pointed out, Congressman, the continuing resolutions is the way the budget is being done now, because the president hasn't given a budget that the Democratic Senate could approve. In fact, they voted his budget down 99 to zip last time around.
99 to 0.
99 to zip.
Do you think, guys, just to put a bow on this thing, do you think that we're going to get to the very end again? Or do you think that we're going to get some kind of resolution?
Let's say it's not the debt limit, it'll be a continuing resolution. That's another thing to check out.
I think
and there's another one also,
to
and that is sequestration, you pointed out, which is another cliff. So one way or the other, spending has to get cut. But the president's got to lead and put spending cuts on the table and what he feels about how you reform entitlements. If he doesn't lead, it ain't going to happen. And that's not me speaking, that's Bob Woodward speaking. He said the president has not been leading in this issue all the way down.
You quoted Bob Woodward. That was a good one.
That's because on this issue, he's the person who's saying.
You didn't get the humor of that.
Oh, I get the look, if Bob Woodward and I agree on this, we got to be right. The president is not leading on this issue.
That was pretty good.
I thought you liked it.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick break here. When we return, it is a new year. When we come back, we're going to talk a little football here. Get ready for the most viewed event in the history of cable television. It begins in a little over an hour. Stay with us, everybody. We'll be right back.